today's special edition of World Insight. The motherland's call to arms, battles fought, sacrifices made, fallen heroes honored. A walk down memory lane in the war against U.S. aggression and aid Korea. Holding the line.
那时候我在军的修路指挥所，
没想那么多，我想我还能够回去。
A war, 70 years ago, the sacrifice of tens of thousands of young lives to safeguard a new People's Republic and resist aggression. Stories retold. History revisited. As the world faces a time of change, war or peace, World Insight Special on the war against the U.S. aggression and aid Korea. The Great Wall was built in ancient China to defend the country from foreign invaders. From the east to the west, it spans a distance of 21,000 kilometers. Where I'm standing right here is the easternmost point of the Great Wall. It is called the Tiger Mountain Great Wall. It was built more than 600 years ago during China's Ming Dynasty. Now this area belongs to the city of Dandong, which borders the DPRK. In China's modern history, Dandong has become an icon of struggle because of a war. The war to resist the U.S. aggression and aid Korea. There's no other place that bears witness to that part of the history better than the bridge right behind me. It's called the Ridgeway Bridge, but now it's really a broken bridge. Due to the aerial attacks by the U.S. side during the Korean War, the bridge only has 4 spans left in the middle of the Yalu River. It used to connect China and Korea, but now it only stops in the middle of the water. Next to the broken bridge is the China-DPRK Friendship Bridge, which was also bombed during the war, but it was repaired. Today it is busy welcoming tourist groups and transporting goods. It is a good reminder of a vivid lesson. The more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in wars. War and peace are complicated relationships. My reporting trip in Dandong, where the Chinese People's Volunteer Army crossed the Yalu River 70 years ago to fight in the war, has been a great reminder of its significance, particularly after meeting those who fought in it and miraculously survived under extreme circumstances. Fan Hongzhi is a 95-year-old veteran I met. Fan was a sapper during the war. He once studied in the esteemed Huangpu Military Academy, the cradle of Chinese military talents. Due to the dramatic political changes in China around the time when the new People's Republic was founded, he joined the Chinese People's Liberation Army before finishing his studies and volunteered for the war and ended up fighting in Korea.
按照这个人民的心理要求啊，不希望有战争。
It's people's hope that there will not be war, but peace, from a historical perspective, must be secured by war.
用战争来保护，这是一个辩证关系。
Peace and war are in a dialectical relationship. If China had not undertaken the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea, it would have faced a series of problems.
种种的一些麻烦。因为朝鲜这个战争，拿的是步枪、轻机枪，没有。
China fought the war with only rifles and light machine guns and defeated the American forces, seizing thousands of vehicles and hundreds of tanks.
坦克几百辆，打出来国威呀。
This war won China prestige, and starting from that time, people would think twice before provoking China. The peace China has enjoyed till now comes from this war.
这就是由这的， 话又说回来，你能把这个
But then again, you can't just start an unjust war against another and sabotage peace. So it's a dialectical relationship.
One aspect that characterized that war 70 years ago was the sharp contrast in armament and logistical support between the Chinese People's Volunteer soldiers and the U.S.-led forces. It was definitely an asymmetric war. As a sapper, Fan Hongzhi understood that well, though still managed to achieve miracles.
有一天早晨，刚起床，那时候我在军的修路指挥所。
I was with the People's Volunteer Army Corps command post for road maintenance when one morning a phone call came from one division that the enemy had dropped bombs during the night, but one of them did not explode. It was now lying in the middle of a road, and the division hoped someone would be assigned to defuse it.
就接着电话，处长就把这个任务交给了我。
I was the one given this assignment. I heard the order and I thought,
我就想啊，我在学校里没学过这玩意儿啊。
no one ever taught me how to do this in school. I'd never seen a bomb in real life.
说这个完成这个任务就很为难呐。
This was a really difficult task, but I didn't shirk from the duty and I accepted it with honor.
愉快地接受任务，我就马上到当地了，边走我边考虑。
On my way there, I decided to detonate the bomb with explosives.
准备用什么呢？引爆办法。我到那一看的话呢，
But when I got there, lying in the middle of the road was a bomb that was about 1 meter long, and it was really thick. I recognized it was a demolition bomb, not a fragmentation bomb, which meant if I detonated it, I would have completed the task of destroying the road that the American plane had failed to achieve.
没有完成这个任务的时候，我给完成，这是一个下策呀。
Blowing it up would be a horrible solution. How could I complete the task of the enemy? A second solution was that there was a deep ditch near the bomb. I could use a rope to drag it into the ditch, which was both safe and quick.
用绳子一拉，冲深沟了以后，
I was about to tell this to the division commander, but decided against it. If our army were to repair the road, push stones down the ditch, the bomb could explode and cause casualties. And unsuspected local people could also be endangered when they grazed livestock. This was also a bad solution.
老乡去放牛碰上了是不是有危险？我这个是也是个下策，所以最后我决定自己亲自排除。
So finally, I decided to defuse it myself. It was not a time bomb, because at the front of it there was a fuse. I was beyond nervous. My uniform was totally soaked,
鸡呀，都湿透了。
and I felt my hair stand up. My comrades in arms stood far away, holding their breath while they watched me. I screwed the fuse, heard a click, and by instinct moved backwards about 2 steps, crawling on the ground. Really, this was useless, because if it did explode, even moving back 20 steps wouldn't help, let alone only 2.
这是一个没有作用的作用，我就给拧下来了。
Then I went back and unscrewed the fuse, but I found there was another one hidden, about the same length. I suddenly remembered my teacher once said, when the bomb crashed to the ground, a spring would give the second fuse force to click with the first one. So I moved to get the second fuse off. I handed over the 2 fuses, each about 1 meter long, to the division commander.
大爷，我交给市里指挥所首长，指挥首长文勇首长就握我的手。
He held my hands and said, "Little comrade, you're so brave and your techniques are brilliant. I will surely report this to our commander." I was so delighted that I had completed the assignment that I jumped up and down on my way back.
走一边跳啊！
After that incident, Fan Hongzhi experienced many more life and death moments until the war ended. Later, he and his family also went through various ups and downs and eventually settled down in Dandong, the city on the border between China and Korea. For civilians, the war that took place 70 years ago can be a lifelong scar. On the banks of the Yalu River, I meet Bi Naize. He was 18 years old when the war started. At the time, B was a local community policeman in Dandong along the Yalu River.
在50年的4月8号。
On November 8, 1950, the U.S. imperialists dispatched dozens of P-51 Mustang heavy bombers and the B-29 heavy bombers too.
B-29的重化机对雅鲁江桥
bombed the Yalu River Bridge and Tian of the DPRK. This blew up the Yalu River Bridge, and Tian became a sea of flames because the U.S. dropped so many incendiary bombs.
因为当时他还投下了不少的燃烧弹，就看见呢一些难民呢。
I saw some Korean refugees and they jumped into the river to escape the bombing. As I was patrolling the local community, I thought as a policeman it is my responsibility to rescue them from the other side of the Yalu River.
我应该对他们抢救，这样我就在这个江边呢找到了一个比较大的这个舢板。
I found a big sampan right by the river from our side, and I rowed to the other side. When I got into the sampan and rowed across, these refugees all piled on, and I told them it won't work. The boat would sink unless they boarded in an orderly way. All the fishermen along the river were evacuated. I was the only one to rescue them.
整个的都撤离了，所以只有我一个人划的过去了啊。 完了以后呢，我就跟他们讲的这个。
Then I told them, after I rescued this group of people, I would come back to rescue the others. So after rescuing these people onto the boat, I swayed the boat back and rescued the others.
But there was constant bombing at that time. How is it possible for you to cross the river again?
I didn't think about that. I just knew I must go back and rescue the rest as I promised. So when rowing the sampan across the river, the enemy plane sprayed bullets and bombs into the river. With an unmistakable bellowing roar, I saw the bullets piercing the river's surface. One of the refugees on the sampan was injured in the arm. At the side of the sampan, a man's shoulder was on fire by incendiary bombs. This person seemed to know how to swim. He or she jumped into the river, then others helped to put out the fire.
What was the weather like that day?
那天天气还非常好。
The weather was very good. This is a great help. But we couldn't see the sun because of the smoke from the bombing. The whole sky was red and darkened. This is the whole process. If you want to ask me about my thoughts, I don't have any more ideas, to be honest. I just thought as a policeman that I should rescue the civilians. As simple as that.
没有更多的想法，只是想我是个警察，应该去救一下，就这么简单。
For many, war is a faraway tragedy, not close to home. But for the veterans and their families, war is so familiar that it's ingrained forever in their family history.
You're watching Holding the Line on World Insight. Still to come, the bravery to take up arms against the odds and courage under fire. A panel discussion on the narratives of the war after the break.
This was a turning point. I mean, a young revolutionary government was standing up against the most powerful, victorious government in the world. That was the United States.
A war 70 years ago, the sacrifice of tens of thousands of young lives to safeguard a new People's Republic and resist aggression. Stories retold. History revisited. As the world faces a time of change, war or peace, World Insight Special on the war against the U.S. aggression and aid Korea. The Korean War is believed to be the forgotten war in the U.S. In China, though, the war against the U.S. aggression and aid Korea is one of bravery and courage under fire. How do we make sense of this part of history? How do we reconcile the very different narratives about this war? Zhao Tong and Einar Tangen were keen to discuss them with me while sitting along the Yalu River. Mr. Zhao, a Chinese scholar who has long followed the situation on the Korean Peninsula and the challenging issue of denuclearization. Mr. Tangen is a Korean American, now lives in China. We're sitting here on the bank of the river. It's already quite chilly, mid-October. We could imagine the lives of the Chinese volunteers 70 years ago during the winter time. What does this war really mean?
Okay, so this was a turning point. I mean, a young revolutionary government was standing up against the most powerful, victorious government in the world. That was the United States. And what had happened is there was great fears that what was, especially on the Chinese side, that they did not want to repeat of the 100 years of humiliation when foreign powers and then the Japanese came in and in essence was trying to control China. So after having victoriously pushed the Japanese out, there was real concern about what MacArthur's real plan was. And we know today that his idea was to roll through Korea, through China, and to his ultimate objective, which was to take on Russia. There was this real feeling among people like him that the U.S. had been pulled into 2 consecutive world wars, and that the only way to prevent this from happening was to literally conquer the entire world. There was no plan on how that would work out, but there was this kind of euphoria that somehow democracy and capitalism would just overtake everything and everyone would be happy. And as we've seen subsequently, it doesn't work that way.
There are a lot of historical records coming out from various sides: China, Russia, the United States, Korea, 2 Koreas in fact, that there are disputed facts. But even despite of that, this is a very significant war for all. So what do you make of this war? The war that China fight against the U.S. aggression to aid Korea.
Well, I think this war really introduced Cold War to the Eastern Asia. Previously, the American attention was on Europe. And this war fundamentally shaped the economic, political, and geostrategic landscape of Northeast Asia. It deeply shaped China. It deeply shaped China-U.S. bilateral relationship. It also raised China's status in the socialist bloc. And I think this war really affected this region even more than half a century later after the war ended. Today, this region is still the last land in the world where the Cold War still remains.
China's war against U.S. aggression to aid Korea, it was a hot debate in China. I mean, at least among the top leadership, whether to go to war or not. Mr. Zhao, I know you've been studying some historical records before coming here, and this is one of your subjects. Tell me more about what's the nature of that debate?
I think, to me, it was a really challenging decision from the Chinese top leaders. At that time, their priority is to advance Chinese national interests. China has now been fully reunified. China needs to unify Taiwan. China needs to liberate Tibet. China also needs to stabilize the internal economic and social situation. Also, China is a country that just fought the Japanese for 8 years, went through a long civil war, and the Chinese people didn't want to go to war. They want to build the country, the new China. So initially, I think the Chinese leaders had no appetite to going into war. But North Korea and South Korea, they started war in June. And even though North Korea made initial quick progress, but quickly after the Americans landed in Incheon, the overall situation was turned over. Americans crossed the 38th parallel, moved all the way to the Chinese border. It's reported that Chinese border was also bombed by American aircraft. So there was growing concern that if this situation continued, China's own territory could be threatened by the United States. So facing that immediate threat, I think Chinese leaders made an important decision to help the North Koreans and resist the Americans.
We've been trying to interview, as earlier program indicated, some veterans. The area where we're sitting right here had been severely bombed by the U.S. Aerial attacks repeatedly during that time. And some of them were trying to help some Koreans to cross the river in order to seek a safer hub. But of course, the personal saga is one thing, but strategically, this has been changing a lot of things. One of the things that we have seen over the past 70 years is people's increasing interest in finding out what really happened, starting from the battlefield to the strategies, to the personalities. It was being termed as a forgotten war in the U.S. Why was it?
Because we weren't successful. I mean, the idea was we had the most powerful military machine. We had won the Second World War. And as I said before, General MacArthur had this kind of sweeping vision. I think there was a racial component in this. While the U.S. had battled the Japanese and earned a lot of respect for them because of the fierceness and willingness to sacrifice that they showed, for some reason he didn't think that that applied to China. And he thought it would be easy to push through China on his way to Russia. And I think he was very much surprised, as was everyone else, at the willingness to do what was necessary, to make sacrifices, even though it was an asymmetrical war. The United States, a military machine, when it finally got in to Busan and these areas, we had tanks, we had aircraft, we had everything that was necessary to really propel war. But even with that, we were only able to get, in essence, a stalemate, to push it back to the 38th parallel, which was the original agreement between the U.S. and Russia as to the division of Korea. So at that point, you know, what can you celebrate at that point? It's things. But it became a kind of a model, unfortunately, having failed once. Then Vietnam came thereafter, and there was this kind of idea, a hardening between ideologies. After that, you know, you had people like McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy, saying that anybody who thought about socialism or communism was an enemy of the U.S. state. And there was a hardening also in communist states where they thought that there were perhaps fifth columns that were trying to destabilize these societies who had just won hard-fought freedom.
Just by the way, we know that the records coming from the U.S. side was once open to public, but since the Bush administration once again classified, so we would not have access to most of these facts anymore, at least about the U.S. side. Talking about the Chinese side, over the years and decades, people look at that war with different angles. At the very beginning of the reform and opening up, when China is getting now stronger, and when China and the U.S. are in a very interesting period of time, for example, right now. Mr. Zhao, how do you see this evolving perception about this war?
Well, I think this war made U.S. and China 20 years enemies. Previously, U.S. was trying to cut China, but after China signed this alliance agreement with the Soviet Union...
I thought that started before, because the People's Republic was founded and the U.S. side was pretty much on the Taiwan issue with China. It's a very big division.
Right, but I think U.S. still had hope that at least China could maintain neutral between Soviet Union and United States. But as the Korean War started, immediately these threats became a real concern to the United States. They worried that communism would spread further, not only overtake the Korean Peninsula, but even expand further into other parts of this region. So it started to see China as a key pillar, as China sends volunteer army into Korea, as a key pillar in the socialist communist bloc. So that really characterized China-U.S. relationship for many years afterwards. But over time, I think this Korean War also sow some seeds in the improvement of U.S.-China relationship. Korean War showed some disagreements between China and the Soviet Union, and as Soviet Union later became a greater threat to China, Mao Zedong made the decision to work closer with the United States to hedge against the Soviet threats. So U.S.-China relationship improved, and today I think the two sides were able to gradually know better about each other. They were able to look at this troublesome history with patience and with sympathy. I think they still have different interpretations of what happened, but now I think they could build upon that and look beyond. So I think it's fortunate that U.S.-China were able to escape this Cold War relationship, but Korea is still trapped in this Cold War mentality and still haven't improved its relationship with the United States.
I would argue the other way around, that there is still a lesson to be learned from that period of time. You know, with the U.S. is sailing ships through the Taiwan Straits, disputing almost every single the four corners of China in terms of Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, in addition to the South China Seas. You know, you feel almost like you're back to this point where there's so many strategic assumptions being made that are wrong, that, you know, somehow China will fold, or that you can make China become something which it isn't. I mean, 40 years of success for China, when everybody, you know, the Economist Intelligence Unit and many others were forecasting every year that it was about to fall. This has really, you know, kind of solidified this idea that somehow China is still somehow inferior to the U.S. And that's not the case. If there's going to be a multilateral world, multipolar, there has to be this understanding that different peoples can take the same different paths to success and prosperity. And this is, you just don't see that.
A war 70 years ago, the sacrifice of tens of thousands of young lives to safeguard a new People's Republic and resist aggression. Stories retold. History revisited. As the world faces a time of change, war or peace, World Insight Special on the war against the U.S. aggression and AIDS Korea. This is a war. Enormous amount of lives were lost. From the Chinese side, from the Korean side, both North and South, and from the U.S. side. There are disputing numbers at this moment coming from all sides, saying how many lives they lost and how many lives are lost by the other side, but certainly for sure enormous. So now in retrospect, when we look at this war and the young lives, younger than you right now sitting here, younger than me, in their early 20s, all of them, it's actually quite surreal to me, sitting on the same riverbank once they war, during the war.
Well, it's same to me. You know, I think as more we reflect upon the war and its casualties, not only to the troops involved but also to the civilians, you know, we increasingly appreciate the cruelty of war and increasingly determined to prevent another war. Another actually positive impact of the Korean War is it's offered an opportunity for U.S.-China, the two big powers, to really understand each other. They understand each other's resolve. They understand the risk and the consequences of testing each other's red lines.
And misinterpreting the other's aim.
Yes, the risks of misunderstanding, but also they understand that both are strong people with strong resolve. You cannot challenge them. They do not bend over pressure. So I think that offered a foundation for a more stable bilateral relation. That's why I think U.S. would be willing to improve relations with China later because it knew that China is a competent country, nation. It can depend on China. So it paved the ground for more stable.
Yeah, but at this point, the lessons of history are not being observed by people like Pompeo and Trump. I mean, they are really pushing all the red lines. And this is what is so disquieting about this whole situation. When you start talking about casualties, we know that at least 3 million people died during that war.
And so many POWs too.
2 million civilians on both total, north and south, about equal numbers. These were brutal atrocities. Families were taken out to the ditch, and the father, the mother, and the children were shot, and their bodies left in the drainage ditch. And this happened on both sides. This is an example that war does not solve anything. It just creates tragedies. But why aren't these lessons being remembered now? It seems that China remembers these much better than our newest crop of people who believe that they can impose a kind of world order on people who are not willing.
During the war, many battles have become well-known battles in modern military history, despite of the fact this is a war many people regretted today. So what about the first 3 battles? It seems that the Chinese volunteer troops were having easy victories, relatively speaking. But then it became much more challenging. Many say this is an asymmetrical war because of logistics support and power between China and U.S. Mr. Zhao, what do you make of it?
I think China made great efforts to make sure that China could present a surprise to the American troops. Chinese decision makers really emphasized the importance of quickly deploying troops into Korea. Some troops were shipped by train all the way from southern China, Fujian province, all the way to the border, and they passed in the northeastern provinces where supplies, warm clothes were already prepared, but they couldn't have time to stop the train and pick up the supplies. That's how much efforts they made to surprise the Americans, and that made an impact. I think the U.S. was not expecting Chinese troops there. They really underestimate Chinese resolve, and even if they fought wars already, the U.S. decision makers thought China was only there to self-defend. It was a small number of Chinese troops, but in fact it was a much larger scale. So basically China was able to quickly knock over the U.S. off balance. And by the end of the second campaign, the U.S. and South Korean troops were pushed beyond the 38th parallel, and by the end of the third campaign, Chinese and North Korean armies were able to retake Seoul. So that was a very quick success. But after the Chinese troops moved to the south part of the Korean Peninsula, the logistic line became too long to maintain. The Americans, they occupy complete dominance in the air, so the logistic line was heavily bombed. So China has to spend a lot of efforts defending that line that distracted the Chinese troops on the front line. And also the heavy, the very cold weather the Chinese troops were wearing not warm enough clothes. It's hard for them to fight with Americans who were very well supplied. So I think the U.S. later on was able to gradually stop Chinese moving forward, and the two sides entered into a stalemate for a long time, of around 2 years.
It's about war and negotiation going on at the same time. That was quite a strenuous efforts from both sides, isn't it?
Yeah, it was, and unfortunately the people who were paying the price were the civilians and the troops on both sides. What was accomplished? At the beginning it was at the 38th parallel, and at the end it was at the 38th parallel. That's why it's the forgotten war in the United States. But for China to actually be able to push back and hold its own was a very, very important first. This was the test of a new government, whether they would be able to protect their own, not only internally, but also externally against what they perceive to be an aggressive power.
And of course that is the only land conflict between China and the U.S. forces in this century. So it's a very interesting case study. Having said that, though, another interesting phenomenon many scholars study today is about the personalities of generals of both sides. Of the U.S. side, first of all, is Mr. MacArthur, and then Mr. Ridgeway, and then for the Chinese side, it's of course General Peng Dehuai, a person with a lot of personality, shall we put it that way, and straightforward guy. So, how do you see the studies and different versions of these historical figures?
Well, I see it, unfortunately, as a number of missteps. I mean, Ridgeway was a professional soldier. He was the one who basically cleaned up the mess MacArthur made by, basically, he thought that the Chinese wouldn't do anything, that he could push through to the Yalu River, that they were going to mop up the North Koreans, and then they were going to be on their way to Moscow. So, despite the fact that his commander-in-chief told him not to do it, sent him a missive beforehand, the CIA misinformed him and said, look, don't worry about the Chinese, they're not ready or prepared, and little did he know that they were. So initially, yes, China had the element of surprise. They came in, and MacArthur didn't know what to do. He had to finally admit that he had exceeded. He had lost his footing, as we said. And at that point, they had to bring in other people to kind of put this thing in check. In the end, he retired, quote, as a hero. But this was definitely the first big blemish on his military career.
Old soldier never die, just to fade away. That, of course, is a well-known quote coming from Mr. MacArthur. Having said that, though, Mr. Zhao, what about Mr. Peng Dehuai?
Well, Mr. Peng, he is a loyal, good soldier. He was basically directly asked by Chairman Mao Zedong to lead the volunteer army. He was not prepared, but he just took the order and did his job very well. So, and he was very decisive in commanding the troops. If his subordinates made mistakes, he would fire them immediately. And he also fought fiercely with his own superiors and colleagues to get necessary supplies for his troops and soldiers. He really loved his soldiers, and therefore...
He insisted on supplies first.
Yes, and therefore he won respect and love back from his own soldiers. And because of his good performance in the war, he was quickly tapped to become China's next national defense minister.
And of course, those figures are historical figures, but they're only appearing these days in history. So that's why, at the end of our conversation, sitting in a quiet corner along the Yalu River, enjoying our moment of peace during the weekend, how do you see war vis-a-vis peace? That's a question I always want to find out some answers about, at least during this trip. Mr. Tangen.
You're going to end up going to war if you forget the lessons of history. It's arrogance. It's not understanding exactly what it is that's going on the other side. And I really feel it. There's an existential threat, or at least perceived threat, on behalf of a lot of developed countries, because they have capitalism and democracy. And they see China's success with a different system as this kind of existential threat. And it shouldn't be that way. As I've said, there are many paths to prosperity. Let each country figure out its own.
Well, for me, sitting here in mid-October, I already felt very cold only after half an hour or so. I can now imagine how the soldiers fought in heavy snow, in environments of 30 degrees minus 0 centigrade, and so many soldiers were frozen to death. So definitely we should do everything to avoid a war, and we should remember the war introduced Cold War into East Asia, and today I think people were talking about another new Cold War between US and China. I think this is the right time for us to reflect upon history and learn lessons to avoid another costly new Cold War.
Well said from both of you. Thank you for doing so much research about this war and talking to us. And thank you for being here so that we will be able to get the history much closer to us in order to find out exactly what happened and in order to learn the real lessons. Einer Tengen, Jiao Tong, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And that leads us to the end of this special edition of our program here on the bank of the Yalu River on the war against the U.S. aggression to aid Korea. During peace times, sons bury their fathers. During war times, fathers bury their sons. The biggest tragedy of human being, of course. And we do not want them to be repeated once again. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team here in Dandong and in Beijing, thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.